So we got a few more minutes. The way I want to handle today's talk, and we'll see who else ends up joining. I laid out my set of things for today's chat. We're going to be going through basically the items in order. I'm going to see how far we can get, and we will spend some time going back over some other things. I'll re-explain this. If there's anything that I didn't put inside of that order or the major points of the chapter, now is the time to definitely say. No one wrote or said anything in the chat over the last 24 hours, so I'm assuming generally people don't give a shit about how this review's done, so I'm happy to take it and run with it.
I think these are definitely some of the more important points. The 4 theses, absolutely. I also like that you want to go back over, again, I kick out of use the word fucking there, but I like that it looks like we're also going to be talking about the role of love in desiring production.
Yes.
Which I think is worthwhile. So I like what you've laid out.
Yeah, they spend a lot of time on the fact of how sex and libido sort of plays in, and how there's no difference between sexual libido, political libido, desire at large, any of these things. It's all essentially the same. That's not an easy thing to sort of break through, so I figured we'd spend some time on it. But again, we're going to wait until probably 5 after to start. My coffee has not kicked in. Jesus, what a morning. All right. Thank all of you for joining us today as we continue or finish our reading of Anti-Oedipus. It has been a long time. It's our first meeting of the new year, and we are going to be reviewing the final section for Batch 5, the second positive task. It is an immeasurably long section. I can't believe we actually made it through this thing. I was reading through it last night and this morning. But we are going to try our best to try to review the more difficult concepts inside of it. Any questions you have, don't hesitate to toss into AO Discussion Chat Live. We will go over all of those things. Excellent. And we have a number of other readings that are happening. Check out our announcements channel. Check out our calendar. We're catching back up on getting this server sort of top notch so people can find the things that but I fully expect us to be spending a little bit longer on a few things. Ken writes, thus spoke Zarathustra is picking back up with Adder's Bite tomorrow on the Continental Philosophy server. I know Kent is back from his little winter hiatus because we all need a break. We all need breaks. So let's go ahead and dive into the second positive task, which is, as I was saying, exceptionally long section, 40 some pages of incredibly dense writing, some paragraphs that go multiple pages. I've tried to break this down into a handful of concepts for us to go over. The first one I want to spend our time on is really the first paragraph, where we talk about ultimately social production, regimes, desiring machines, how they fit into all of these things, and how social investments happen. That very, very sort of early paragraph. I'm going to take a crack at how I have interpreted this section and this concept around it. One of the things they're really dying for us to understand is that it's not so much that they've, and I had this misunderstanding myself prior to this specific reading, that we have desiring machines and then we have social machines. One of the really difficult things to grasp sort of in this entire thing is that we're ultimately talking about, as they talk about the molar and the molecular, that the desiring machines are the sort of tiny semi-individualistic or individualistic versions of what's happening inside the social machines. But there's no desiring machines that exist outside of social machines, just as there are no social machines that exist without desiring machines as their sort of components.
I think so, because desiring machines and social machines are simultaneity, right? The molar and the molecular work as a way of, so it's a perspective on the two, right? When we're talking about the molar, we're talking about social machines in that manner. And that helps us kind of like talk about the simultaneity, but also talk about what they call the regimes.
Yeah, and this is what Varun posted very quickly, and he posted it a couple times on the server, just I think to drive the point home, but I'm going to read it. In terms of something like Anti-Oedipus, people seem to struggle by asking questions as to what comes first, desire or the organization of machines. However, such an either or question is missing the point, as they fail to understand the relationship of immanence between desire and the organization of machines. Flows of desire power the organization of the machine. The flows of desire themselves power the organization. Yet simultaneously, the organization of machines guide the flows of desire. I believe the body without organs, as a system of recorded rules, allows this process of immanent simultaneity where desire is both the cause and effect, as is seen by the Seravatsur. You can't have desire without it being organized, and you can't have machines without it being organized by desire. And that's essentially, he's talking about what's happening at that unconscious level. With the second positive task, it's important that we extrapolate from what is happening with the desiring machines at that level and start talking about how they fit in or how they are part of these larger social machines, these larger regimes, these gregarious largesse, as we will go over at some point. But the reason I bring this up is because they talk a little bit towards that very ending, and it's part of the thing I wanted to ask and get people's thoughts on. We contrasted, again, is staking out the perverse reterritorializations and as the movement of the schizophrenic deterritorializations. We contrasted them as the two major types of equally social investments, one sedentary and biunivocalizing, and of a reactionary or fascist tendency, the paranoiac investments, the other nomadic and polyvocal of a revolutionary tendency, the schizo investment. In fact, in the Schizoid Declaration, I am of a race inferior for all eternity, I am a beast, a black, we are all German Jews. The historico-social field is no less invested than in the paranoiac. I am one of your kind from the same place as you. I'm a pure Aryan of a superior race for all time. That last grouping of comments here struck me as something I'm having trouble sort of reconciling the two sides of this, because it seems to me what they're saying here is that these things essentially are happening with the simultaneity as well. That the reactionary, the nomadic, these things are also invested. The schizo is also invested in the paranoiac and vice versa.
Well, if we start with desire, I don't know, like there's a drying machine. I don't know if it.
You're fine. I've got cleaners on the audio. You're set, buddy.
Perfect. So if we take desire as the basis of everything, so desire is not, there's no inherent quality to desire. It just erupts and flows, and there's two tendencies in which it can express itself, either like on the paranoid side or on the schizo side. So on one side, it's how it structures something, how it's stabilized and it fixes either like structures or meaning or certain authorities. On the other side, it's how it puts the flow back into movement. So they're always going to be there, both of them at the same time, because even like if you structure something, it tends to degrade, to actually move away from its structuration. So there's always those two movements into everything. Life is like this also, like a body. Like a body is something that is, being fixated, but at the same time degrading. There's like everything that passes through us. So it seems difficult to understand at first, but at the same time, if we look at concrete examples, metal, like geological stratas or anything like rocks, everything is both structured and destructured at the same time, if you want.
Yeah, I think that's right, because this is their point about the simultaneity, right? As investments are made, they coexist, right? So there's a simultaneity. So when we talk later about love, they talk about love as a kind of index of these investments, right? So when you get the schizoid investment of like, we are of the inferior race, we are all German Jews, we find that present in the socio-historical field, right? In the social realm, alongside the investment of, but I am of the master race, right? So like to Roger's point, we find this is kind of the delirium they're talking about. There's the simultaneity there, and they don't necessarily. It's not so much that they contradict each other, like it's that in the sense that one of them's got to be right. It's that they're both present and effective.
Right.
Yeah, sorry if I brought it out of the individual field, as of the more psychological aspect. But I'm always talking from like other books. But yeah, so it's what Jack just said, and if we want to bring it back to individual desire, there's also like in us, in one individual, for example, there's always going to be those two poles, and we oscillate between those two poles all the time. Anxiety, or either our more pathological sides, are trying to find meaning, trying to fix stuff, but at the same time there's our drives that actually deterritorialize us and pushes us outward.
Well, so the reason this last part of the paragraph is a question I have is I've seen it, I've heard it interpreted and read it interpreted in a couple different ways. The primary way I've heard people talk about this is that their references here, I am the race inferior for all eternity, beast of black, we're all German Jews, is placing themselves at the lowest possible place that there could be in a social hierarchy versus the historical social field. The paranoiac formula enables a person to basically trace themselves back to God, very similar to the despots sort of. It's we're the best, we're the most important, I'm the most important, I have that certainty. But I've also heard the second part. Yes, I don't think anyone disagrees with that. The paranoiac pushes towards this certainty of your own grandeur. But the first part has a distinct part of persecution. A race inferior, a beast of black, German Jews. The examples that they use here and throughout the book really are about sort of the self-persecuting or the identification with persecuted groups. That maybe that's the persecuting group that has all the power on the paranoiac side, the persecuted group on the schizo side who has none of the power. It's a different interpretation, and I don't really have a clean line on that.
So to tackle that, let's talk about in terms of becomings, right, and codes and territories. So how I understand this is like, it's not that necessarily they're referring to like clear groups and that they're talking about more directly like the intensities and the codes that allow for something like a master race, or that allow for something like German Jews, or to be a black, or to be a beast here. That's the first place to start. Is they're not trying. I don't think they're trying to make it like. I don't think we want to read it in terms of like an essentialism to groups. I'm not saying that we are, but just to start with that clarification. So I think where they're moving here is that the schizophrenic, in terms of the deterritorializing and the decoding and that, it allows for one to become in that sense. So if we look at the paranoiac there, the only becoming available to people is that of the Aryan or the master race, right? It's the majoritarianism. And that's important. It's not the majority, it's the majoritarianism. It's the becoming that's open to them as being part of like the exclusivity. In terms of the schizophrenic allows for one to become, right. So like they give the example of Judge Schraber, where Judge Schraber becomes Aryan, becomes Mongol, becomes beast. In this sense, Judge Schraber does have the schizophrenic flow, in the sense that there's a series of becomings that they're moving through. So they're being recoded and reterritorialized in that sense.
Yeah, I think there's a little thing that we need to say about the majoritarian. There's no becoming into the molar. It's already the standard. So the becoming is not the sedentarized kind of identity. Is the nomadic possibilities, or the openness of the Minotaurian. So there's always this difference. One can move and the other cannot move. One can escape, the categories or the capturing aspect of the state, while the majoritarian is the capturing aspect. So if we see it in those two poles, one that escapes and one that captures, it can help us understand this a little bit better. And what is a minority in that sense? It's not really the persecuted; it's the one that escapes the capture, and one that is not defining the molar. So you're just like always like a little bit on the outside, not to say on the margin, but something that is something that is not captured. So like if we put this into those terms, it can help us a little bit to understand a little bit better. And the Minotaurian is not an essence or a crystallized identity. Is something that can become majority. It can become molar because it can be captured and integrated into the state and change the standards or the norms or whatever else. And so there's always this flux that is going, and the more minorities are integrated into the molar, the more we produce other minorities.
So
yeah, and just to make a quick point, and I want to make that distinction too, because I don't want to make the paranoiac into a form of narcissism here. And part of the reason I'm making this clarification really briefly is that, especially coming out of going into psychoanalysis this way, that kind of tool is there. So that's the other thing, is I want to clarify that like the majoritarianism is not necessarily somebody's narcissism.
So the next paragraph actually says something that I think, and again, this is why I think disagrees a bit with you, Roger, or maybe I'm misunderstanding. The way that they're talking about the molecular, which is the schizo, and the molar, which is the paranoiac, that's the other sort of part of these poles. There's no such thing as a schizomolar investment or a paranoiac molecular. The answer is, as they say, that everywhere there exists the molecular and the molar, all is one and the same. So when you have the majoritarian, you naturally have the minoritarian. In order to have the Aryan side, you have to have the people who are the persecuted Jews, is how I read that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're always defined, as somebody, something that is going to be minoritarian. It's a difference from the molar. There's a whole system of domination, but like you find those categories there as a differentiation. And as a woman is a differentiation from men, as people with disabilities are a differentiation from people with without disabilities, and the concepts of race function into the same way. And if the system was structured differently, the minoritarian perspectives would be different. If we would have like a full disabled women's society, it's the other poles that would be minoritarian. So they're always in relation with one another, but they don't contain one another in the sense that they're all the same. There's always a part of differentiation playing.
No, I don't follow. I follow to a point. So that the core concept, if we think of the socialist, this large tapestry, that there are parts of it at this molar level that are sort of more intense than, like, and again, in layers of intensity, latitudes, longitudes, however phrasing they want to do it. But that throughout this entire thing, there's different layers where different levels of these sort of molecular occurrences happen within it, because they're all part of that same thing. The question I'm having then is, when they talk about the schizoid declaration, again, I am a race inferior for all eternity, they go through here, and it's a very specific, they're constantly talking through persecuted, separated, minoritarian people. With that persecuted part is the part that I'm fascinated by, because it's also the way Guattari talks about it in Chaosophy. It's the terminology that they very much use is focused around this idea of the persecuted minority for the schizoid investments. And I wondered if that's just me overreading into a thing, which would not be a first time. But then again, I always say you can't overread to lose. So figured I'd ask.
So if we use the example of like gay rights activism or LGBT rights activism, right? There's a sense in which the majoritarianism can be said that can be said to occur through that of rights, right? So to be in the to be in the master race here is to have access to the rights, yeah. So in this sense, right, this isn't necessarily a question of persecution unless you look at it from the perspective of, well, who has rights and who doesn't, right? Should there be a right to marry outside of the heterosexual marriage? That's a question we can talk about. But I think for Deleuze and Guattari, what they're getting at is, in the sense of a line of escape, it is possible for the LGBTQ plus community in this sense, instead of focusing on rights here and being part of becoming within the majoritarian, it is possible for them, in this sense, these codes and these territorialities, right, the intensities that are opened up here, allow for a sense of becoming away from that moves somewhere else. So yes, they are focusing on they're talking about beasts here, so they're talking about animals. They're talking about blats, and I believe they use a stronger word than that. So they are focusing on those minority groups there, but I don't know if they're necessarily trying to say like the persecuted is the potential. I think what they're getting at is these kind of becomings are open here, in contrast to the majority, because, and this is kind of what Roger was alluding to, right? If we were to replace, they give the example of going from a patriarchy to a matriarchy, would be to reproduce the very problem, right? The majoritarianism does have a kind of becoming in itself, right? Even though it's a very flat becoming in that sense, it's very exclusive. It is possible to change, right? So today it could be white male, tomorrow it could be white female in a sense. Does that make sense?
It helps. It does help. Makes sense is a larger thing that I've got to decide on whether or not it does, but it does help sort of make it through. Also, what Angus is saying, just to repeat it, I think part of it is that the minoritarian cannot become majoritarian. That would be to cease being minoritarian. So there's a kind of necessary subjugation inherent in being minoritarian. I think that fits more with how I've been reading their talk through, because they go on, and again, to be very clear, they go on to talk about in this paragraph the schizophrenic process is what we're really studying here, not the schizophrenic. The schizophrenic escapes society and just disappears from it, whereas the schizophrenic process enables the revolutionary to actually utilize an understanding of how the social is built in order to collapse it as, part of the escape, and to force part of the social to escape with them. So it's
see you're mentioning the escape. So like the base of the politics of Deleuze and Guattari is the escape. It's saying that to become nomad, to actually, because when you're into this dominated position, there's possibilities that open there, and the potentials can pass into the actual. And it is those conditions that allow for the possibility of either resistance or, opening what they would say like a line of flight to escape and be like imperceptible, just to escape the capture of the states. So, there's the concept of escape is fundamental here into their politics, because it's like to create a war machine, because that they're going to talk about this in other books, but it's to create a war machine that goes against the state and allows for deterritorialization.
Yeah, and in this sense, that's why I made the point about the essentialism too, because like when we're talking about something like white male or these the Aryans, the master race, the beast, the black, we're talking about, at least how I read Deleuze and Guattari, how these are structured through code. Well, I shouldn't say structured. How these are constructed through codes and in relation to intensities and effects. So, right, it's not that someone is naturally a beast or naturally black in this sense. It's that they're affected and coded during this desiring production. In that sense, they're moving through the territories but they also get recoded and reterritorialized.
It's interesting to consider because, again, the first thesis of schizoanalysis is this idea that every investment is both, let me get the wording right, molar and social. That the investments that we maintain and that we take part in don't exist at the molecular level. They are social. They exist at the sort of aggregate level of molecular, but they are molar and they are social. So when we talk about how our investments capture these things and how these things operate, that they operate at the social and the molar level. It's the first theses that they go over here, and it's worth, I guess, starting the discussion on that.
Before we get to that, I just want to highlight on 341 to expand on this discussion and bridge into that first thesis, right? So they talk about the large aggregates, the large forms of gregariousness. So that's something to keep in mind when we're talking about majoritarianism in that sense. But I also want to highlight real quick in a more large sense, where they talk about the schizophrenic, because it's not necessarily that the schizophrenic is always revolutionary in this sense. Just because deterritorializing happens doesn't necessarily mean a revolutionary potential has been invested. So they write, there is a whole world of difference between the schizo and the revolutionary. The difference between the one who escapes and the one who knows how to make what he is escaping escape, collapsing a filthy drainage pipe, causing a deluge to break loose, liberating a flow, resecting a skids. The schizo is not revolutionary, but the schizophrenic process, in terms of which the schizo is merely the interruption, or the continuation in the void, is the potential for revolution. To those who say that escaping is not courageous, we answer, what is not escape and social investment at the same time? The choice is between one of the two poles. The paranoia counter-escape that motivates all the conformist, reactionary, and fascising investments, and the schizophrenic escape convertible into a revolutionary investment.
Can you give us a little bit of analysis on that?
Yeah. So the reason I'm bringing this up is just to say that, like, when we're talking about the paranoia and the schizophrenic, there is this delirium in terms of oscillation in that. But I want to clarify too that with deterritorializing and decoding, there is still this potential there for a reactionary investment, right? So like they talk about elsewhere with the diagram on, I think it's 281, the difference between a breakthrough and breakdown, which they expand on in this chapter, or in this section, I believe, around where art and science is at. But to highlight this, right, I think they want to clarify that the schizo-revolutionary, as opposed to the schizophrenic process that does a revolutionary investment, doesn't simply just deterritorialize and reterritorialize, right? It allows for a line of escape, which seems to be something we were centering on toward the end of our discussion, is like, in this sense, right, like to go back to the question of like, do we do rights or do we do something else? There's a way in which something schizo-revolutionary would take what's going on in this assemblage and allow for an escape to move outward, right? So like the deterritorializing and the decoding allows for a revolutionary investment in the sense that what's taken from this assemblage can kind of differentiate in that sense.
I'm having trouble following because I'm trying to think of real world examples or ways to describe this that are more allegorical, because the words in theory, I mean, yes, we've read through the chapter, but actually grasping it, I'm having more of trouble doing. So when we're talking about the investments in the molar, they go on 342. Let us recall the major traits of molar formation or of a form of gregariousness. Unity can be a biological unity of a species, structural unity of a socius, an organism, social or living. It is relation to this new order that the partial objects of molecular order appear as lack at the same time that the whole self is said to be lacked by partial objects. They go on and on. They describe sort of the creation of these gregarious herd instincts that then basically, because our desiring machines are parts of them, they actually as Varun was talking about back and state that the machines become organized in order to serve these sort of larger gregarious outcroppings of molar investments, and desire becomes shaped by that, with blockages, with disjunctions, whatever it may be, with connections. Our machines get organized that way in an unconscious sense. Am I following that generally right? Because I think that if that's the case, there's a handful of really solid, like, real world examples I'm sure we could come up with to describe this better.
Yeah, it is kind of difficult because we've got to talk about what's happening in terms of like opening up the comments to make it really simple, right? And I think that does happen.
Well, I mean, we can get to that point, but I think I'd like to discuss like the text as it's written. They don't bring up becomings for some time in this section. Right now, they're really diving into this idea that every investment is social, and in any case bears upon a social historical field. Investments are social, investments are molar. That is their first thesis. And what that tends to mean to me is that we don't invest in things on a individual level. We only do so as part of a larger gregarious norm, the herd instinct that they go into for the next handful of chapters. I won't say it's a BWO, but it's pushing towards the way a BWO operates. But we become part of these sort of things, and our desires match up with that, where they step in line like good little soldiers in order to get the gregariousness sort of realized. It feels like a simple question, and we should be able to answer it at some point here soon.
All right, re-ask your question.
Okay. If every investment is social and molar, those investments by nature reorganize the desire at molecular levels inside of it, because molar and molecular essentially exist as part of the same social machines. So as our investments change, they can only be molar. Period. As our investments change, so do our desires, because our desires are part of that same machine. In the same way that if I were to say excellent and wave a wand and suddenly have the Tesla factory become a battery factory or a ventilator factory, the larger thing that it is, I've shifted it, and the machines inside have to change in order to continue to produce the thing. And the people inside of that need to change how they operate the machines in order to produce that thing, which they generally do. And our unconscious operates not drastically differently from that. As our investments shift, the molecular and desiring machines shift and reorganize in various ways in order to continue to produce that and make sure our desire is in line with those larger scale investments.
I'm not sure if we have the same understanding. I'm just like trying to piece stuff together, not to say something too hasty or stupid, but so please continue.
So each of the individual desiring machines doesn't have a goal or intention. Desiring machines on their own produce. It's what they do. They get laid out in specific orders in our unconscious, or laid out in specific orders at a social level. And these are the things that become molar investments. But it's not that they become molar investments. It's that we have molar investments, and it creates, it sort of realigns desire in order to produce that. This is where I'm having, I guess, the issue with the early parts of this section is I suppose at a very basic understanding of where our desiring machines, if everything is molecular and molar at the same time, and there's a simultaneity to that, then if every investment is therefore social and molar, it would reorganize in the same time our molecular and desiring machine.
Okay, let's take concrete examples. Let's take the family as a molar aggregate, and the species. So the family is, in what you're conveying is a molar, and it's a site of molar investment. So basically, we are investing order into the family, but the family doesn't really exist. We set it in motion by stating its existence. And by this, we organize the relationship between the entities that are forming this family. So, father, mother, children, aunts, grandfather, it can be really extensive. or the species, for example. We have what we call an elephant, but an elephant, is a sub category of a larger aggregate as well. So it's a classification, and it's we classify elephants by with having legs and ears and everything, certain characteristic that makes it fit into being an elephant. So into those two groups, there's this pre how do you say this in English? This presupposed order, and then you can actually classify all the elements regarding if they fit or they have either a lack or or if they are a surplus. So this putting everything into this kind of order makes it that you will crush the differentiation of the minority by making it fit in. So the Oedipal characteristic of the family, for example, will actually reorganize desire and reorganize the minoritarian becomings into setting them towards the molar.
Okay, so you're saying that the molar, the gregarious, leads to the selection of desires.
Yes.
But they specifically say on top of 344, the order is not gregariousness to selection, but on contrary, molecular multiplicity to forms of selection performing the selection, to molar gregarious aggregates that result from the selection. And how I read that is that it's not that the gregariousness or the large form or the social investment is at any point the sort of starting point. Instead, it's 10,000 people out of 12.
No, but that's exactly what I'm saying. The species does not exist and the family does not exist. It's being formed by the organization. And then it becomes a thing. It becomes a power. It becomes a pole. And then from there, the relations are being organized. So it's always like I don't like this word, but like it's
okay. Let me try it because I think I'm understanding what you're saying. What an American is, let's say that. Lots of people have different opinions on what an American is, who is inside of America. But at large, there is a generalized opinion of American exceptionalism, the ability to bomb other countries, all kinds of things. These are formed by lots of different people having these opinions.
And because you bomb people, you are American. That's the way to see it.
So the forms of the selection begin performing the selection. And at that point, the molar or gregarious aggregates can be named and they result from that selection process. That determines ultimately what an American is. So it's the molecular multiplicities, all of the desiring machines clumped together. We take generally on average what they believe for X. X then selects other things that are doing X, kind of replicating itself. And at that point, the molar or gregarious aggregate comes from that at a social level.
Mm-hmm. And then when it becomes crystallized as a category, it starts acting, and then there's modalities of control, of surveillance that starts from there. So there's always like this kind of weird mix between the assemblage and the apparatus. But it's not the beginning. Like the state is not the beginning. It's modalities of control that has been like established to organize relation that have become the state, and then the state as a structured resulting from this organization of power and relation, acts back. So that would be the same for any kind of formation that is acting on the molar level.
So again, we get back to the idea essentially that gregariousness. I don't want to say doesn't exist because that's not the way to put it, but that it isn't the impetus behind these things. Instead, that's actually the molecular multiplicity and the law of averages that determines what ultimately is that gregariousness.
Yeah, but they make the difference between the molar and the molecular. So there's always like I don't know, like they don't explain it that way, but there's like a threshold that you pass as a molecular that becomes molar. So it's where you find yourself into the statistical aggregate.
Am I at least making a little bit more sense now? I think I'm understanding you.
Yeah, it's tough, because the problem of the species, and I've been like dwelling on this for a little while because we were working on taxonomies and stuff, and we understand species, as an individual would be an expression of the species category, like an individual elephant would be the expression of something that we presuppose that exists, which is a species. But the species in this, it doesn't exist materially. The elephant exists materially, and it's the aggregate of individual or certain characteristic that constitute the species. But every it every specific elephant is not the expression of a species, because the species is just a category.
Well, it feels like this is not to sort of dive to another subject, but this feels like the kind of discussion we could have around what whiteness is. Because race is such a fascinating thing at a social level, but whiteness doesn't exist. It's a fungible thing that shifts over time based upon lots of different things that are happening within society.
It doesn't have a natural existence.
Yeah.
So, if we want to, I think that could lead to problematic discussions. But let's take gender. It's something that has been mapped, and there's a whole cartography of gender. It's like, the queer criticism of gender says that we're always moving, we're always molecular, but we are being moved towards the molar aggregate of the man or the woman. So queerness is saying that we are molecular beings with certain expression that don't have to fit with the normative categories. That I think that's a easy example. Gender exists in the sense that we created it, and those molar aggregates, they exist because they are statistical aggregate, and then they become acting forces into controlling the expression of the intensities in everybody's.
Yeah, I don't know if this will help, but I'm going to use something that my college economics prof actually gave me. So we can read this in terms of gregarious. We can read this in terms of steps: first gregariousness, then selection, or we can read this in terms of implication. That is to say, molecular multiplicity implies that there are forms of selection performing the selection, which also implies molar or gregarious aggregates that result from the selection. The reason I'm saying this is like where we find the elephant, right? And I don't mean the elephant in this category, but the elephant as like the molar assemblage in that sense, right? As a kind of social machine in that sense. We have that, and then we have the molecular of the desire machines that make all that are interrelated with that regime, right? And that way you have the two working back on each other. So, right, like what the elephant is in the molar sense works upon the molecular in the same way the molecular works upon that molarity. The trick is really, I think, that it's not like there's an essence of the elephant any more than there's necessarily like a categorical transcendence of the elephant.
Any other questions before we move on to the second thesis? Anyone here, really? I know it's just 4 of us so far talking, but really anyone is free to talk. It's okay.
Okay, so I think that in order to understand this question you're talking about, you have to go back to Simondon and realize that Simondon posits that there are pre-individuals and the trans-individual on either side of the individual level. And so the desiring machines are the pre-individual level, and the socius is the trans-individual level. So the socius is not the category of society. That's why Simondon talks about the trans-individual, because it's not the category of society. And but the pre-individual is prior. The ontogenesis occurs, and the individual arises out of the pre-individual, but the pre-individual never goes away. So the pre-individual is always there, and that's where all the new connections in the rhizome come from. is from this kind of virtual particles, virtual relations of the pre-individual that are always there as a background for any particular connection between desiring machines and the rhizome. And so it seems to me that this question of gregariousness versus the desiring machines, the whole idea here is that that whatever the social formation is, that what we're asked to do is go back and look at the desiring machines that are the real things that are operating, that are producing that molar configuration. And it seems to me that that's the key point.
Thank you, Kent. Tiernan has a great question. Can someone say more on the differentiation between the socius and social?
So, the social, in sociology is a category, right? But by the socius, they don't mean the social, because they mean the molar formations themselves that we categorize by sociality, but those categorizations are abstractions and simplifications of the real probabilistic interaction that's happening, that's producing this apparent molar phenomena of the family, for instance. And it's not the elephant, it's the elephant as a group of mammals that is the corollary of the family. The individual elephant is is not the proper corollary there. The elephants have their molar configuration of their elephant family, and the humans have their human family. Those are molar organizations that are trans-individual, but swarming around them is always the pre-individual, so that new desires can always come into effect and change what's actually the actual phenomena that's being categorized.
And it's that last part that I've always understood the socius to be the place where desire gets coded and decoded, like how desire gets sort of messed with, like that place, because the desire exists at the unconscious level. At some point it needs to move into being coded, being uncoded, recoded, whatever that is, and the socius operates as that place that these things that happens, whereas the social is the sort of large scale interaction between people and desiring machines.
Yeah, the social is meant to be a category,
yeah,
by which, like, sociologists would study what's going on in society. And that's supposed to be sui generis, kind of like phenomena that a science can look at. But whatever the categories that the science comes up with, there's a real phenomena going on there in that's different in every family, which are these molar structures of the socius, which are trans-individual, and those things are constantly changing. So what you have to look at, I think, in schizoanalysis is given a particular family and their molar relations that are changing on a daily basis, what are the desires that are being expressed at any given time, and how do they connect with each other? But those are based on these pre-individuals, which are really in wild being. And those pre-individuals are the constant connections between partial objects that become these desiring machines. And the metaphysical premise of Deleuze and Guattari is that it's desiring machines all the way down to the perfect continuity that is the base condition. So it's a kind of relational monadology that is being projected as the structures that are underlying all phenomena.
It's 100% part of them trying to get away from, I don't know, idealism for sure. I would say the transcendentalism that sort of has come before them that other philosophers of this time were taking on. This idea that there's these large scale things that are eternal, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, no, there's shit's happening in front of people. It's happening at a material level. Here's how it works. And the socius is their way of saying, look, desire shifts over time. It changes. And it changes how it works. Like the socialists think of it as not so much a desiring machine, but kind of a meta machine that makes machines and organizes them. And how does that get organized? Originally, the Earth did it because of the things and the way things were set up very basically. And then the despot was the reason that machines existed and how they moved. And now it's capital, the almighty dollar or whatever that is the socius that determines how our desire gets decoded, recoded, moved around, that meta machine that does these things. And it does it at a material level inside of our unconscious, is my understanding of the term.
Well, I think one of the things we have to remember is that just prior to this time, people were getting, because phenomenology was in full bloom, people were getting away from, making metaphysical claims. And so Deleuze and Guattari kind of switched around and said, we're not afraid to make a metaphysical claim like Leibniz did in his monadology, or Tarde did for society, or Herbart did for psychology. They all created monadisms. And Deleuze and Guattari says, we're going to make a monadism, but it's going to be a relational monadism. Basically, we're going to see everything as desiring machines. And so then they fit that into this model of Hemslev in order to be able to coordinate the view of the desiring machines versus the socius. Anyway, I think that's a way of looking at it to kind of try to get an overview of what's going on here, because I think we have a problem a lot of times of seeing the forest for the trees. We get lost in the trees, and every once in a while we have to step back and say, what are these guys trying to do that is different from what other philosophers are trying to do? And I think one of them is that they're going back to making metaphysical claims that there is a relational monadology at the basis of everything.
I am going to try to push us into the second thesis. After that, we're going to cut that discussion there. I think we can have it another time, but we could spend hours on this, and I'm trying to get to at some point actually describing what's in this section. I think we'll get there at some point. The second thesis that comes up is within social investments, we distinguish the unconscious libidinal investment of group or desire, the preconscious investment of class or interest. The preconscious investment of class or interest passes by way of large social goals. It concerns the organism and collective organs, including arranged vacuoles and lack. This is one that when we were reading, I said we have to come back to because I fully don't grasp it. Would someone like to take a crack at explaining it? Because I have the Holland explanation here and I'm happy to dive in. All right, I'll give it a shot. To just read Holland, and I'm reading from his analysis of it, page 102. What he's saying is, what desire invests, first of all and most fundamentally, is not this or that object, nor this or that objective goal, but a degree of development of force. Even though such force is usually most easily and widely accessible through the power structure or form of sovereignty that developed and organized it. They has as examples. Capitalism is unusual, if not unique, in that its market mechanisms sometimes grant access to the productive forces of capital outside the established structures of power. The degree of development of force is primary. For what that force is used for, its goals, aims, and corresponding interests of those invested in it, is strictly secondary. It will always get rationalized ex post facto, after the fact. Desire and interests coexist, and interests have an undeniable role to play, for it is under the cover of aims and interests that desire invests the social full body. Nonetheless, the fact remains, this is his quote, the fact remains that there exists a disinterested love of the social machine, of the form of power, and of the degree of development in and for themselves. It is this love or desire, however absurd or rational, that is determinate. After reading this last night, I'm going to continue to make declarative statements that make me look like an ass, so feel free to tell me in the chat that once again you don't understand me. It's perfectly fine. If anyone has a better explanation of this, ultimately, what they're saying by the second thesis is that at first, desire exists, and desire doesn't really care where it goes. It is a force that is able to be generated. The machines that it generates put it inside of a certain direction, and that at the pre-conscious level, investment or class and interest is purely secondary. Now, the degree of that force and where it can be utilized is what is sort of done at that pre-conscious level. But desire comes before that. We can't start at class investment. We actually have to go deeper.
Yeah, so a lot of this is responding to like the use of. So we all know, like for the Marxian sense, right? The analysis can start and sort of end at ideology, right? Which for them is this pre-conscious thing. So, right, we can talk about, well, that's just your ideology talking. And you can do that. But there then becomes a problem there, right? Where does the ideology even come from? And how is the ideology actually, right? Because now you're arguing sort of that the ideology is playing itself out through the person. And that can get you into some troubles here. Especially because the ideology sort of seems transcendent there. But to your point, Brooks, yeah, I think Deleuze and Guattari are trying to say, right, what's actually happening is, right, goals and things like that, rationalizations, those themselves are produced, and they're sort of produced on top of what's happening. So, right, this is where they make the point about, like, something can be pre-consciously revolutionary. So we can talk about a revolutionary ideology, to be a Bolshevik, to be for the cause. And I'm being specific here, right? Because what they're attacking here too, I think, is something of a gregariousness within, like, to sort of idealize the group in this manner, right? To be for the cause or for the goal. In contrast to, like, how this is all being produced and what's kind of underlying it. Or more simply, to your point about class is not a natural thing. It's not as though we're all middle class or lower class or anything like that, right? It's not a natural category that we find ourselves in, right? These are codes and territorialities that are unconsciously occurring and that we find ourselves produced sort of within. Oh shoot, Brooks, I was trying to respond to you. Okay, does everyone understand what I'm saying? Oh, Brooks is back. Brooks, did you catch what I was saying?
No, I didn't. I had to use the restroom.
Okay. So what I was saying is, like, to your example of, like, the classes and that, it's not as though we naturally exist in classes or that classes are a pre-conscious thing. So, like, in terms of ideology, right? It's not that it's your proletarianism speaking any more than an ideology is speaking, right? So this is to say, right, it's not as though we can criticize someone for being a Bolshevik, and in that sense, right, criticizing Bolshevikism in terms of an ideology that's playing out through the person or the individual, or even the group necessarily. Because that Bolshevikism, or more directly, like the codes and the territorialities that are actually present, as opposed to something like a transcendent identity of the group, those are what's, for Deleuze and Guattari, are making any of that even possible in the first place. So something like being for the cause or being for goals, all these goals are sort of created, right? They're produced. It's not that they're naturally there or that one must take them for granted with an ideology. Their point seems to be getting at not only how these are produced, right? And therefore getting away from just doing an analysis of ideology in order to make the argument here. Their point seems to be to get at how codes and territorialities, right, how intensities and effects are actually playing out unconsciously, and in that sense, right, what's underneath the goals or the justifications, right, in terms of like just talking about a rationalization through the preconscious. They want to get at what's happening sort of beyond that, or more directly, what's happening unconsciously.
Yes, because ultimately the thing that is happening in the unconscious, after the fact, they're able to justify it. They have these preconscious investments that, according to the first theses, are ultimately generated by the large aggregate gregarious stories. And they may be oppressive, they generally are, but they may not be oppressive, but you're able to justify your place within them after the fact, after you've already had the desires sort of developed. Is there a way for us to go beyond that and step further into what the actual person wants and how to put forward that?
Yeah, and like let's go back to like the criticism of psychoanalysis that they're putting. When they say, "Oh, the psychoanalyst lays you on the couch and tells you to say daddy and say mommy, and then you're cured because you re-entered the correct order that they're trying to impose on you." And when we're talking about gender, is the same kind of thing. The moment you say men, the moment you say women, is like you recognize the transcendent identity, and then you abide by it. So you obey the code that is being conveyed by this form of molar aggregate.
Well, it's the hilarious juxtaposition we're seeing now in sort of the extreme right, where they carry the "Don't Tread on Me" flags as they're protesting to support the police. Like weird things like that you can say that they have this preconscious class interest. They're able to justify whatever they want after the fact, but what is the thing they're actually hoping for at their desiring machine level? And they're able to find these things to coincide. They just, they may coincide, but they aren't one and the same, I guess, is their ultimate stance here, is that the desire comes before.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the example though, because in the Marxist sense, it would just be like a false consciousness kind of thing, or like a misinterpretation of history or of symbols. But yeah, it's like the alt-right, it's a white people desire. That's what it is. So it's a complete reactionary and paranoid reaction. And what it tries to do is to reinforce the molar aggregate that is already in place as a form of like white supremacy or a white leaning system. And they're going to use the symbols to actually justify their position. But yeah, it's like it's either like you take the formation of the Proud Boys, for example, as what they do, what they say, what they stand for, and how they organize and where they're from, versus starting from a systemic point of view, saying, oh, the Proud Boys are the expression of the system, but maybe that the system is just an aggregate of Proud Boys in a more invisible form.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I think they're attacking, is like, or at least I don't want to say attacking, that's what they're kind of criticizing, and I think kind of moving away from, is like the Marxian false consciousness, or like the ideology. Because that would be the thing, right? Is we can say, well, your justifications are like, a misstatement of ideology and all that, right? But I think what they're trying to move away from there is that very act, which is to say, like, the justifications in that, in terms of something like justice, right? Which is what those groups, and what I hear you saying, Roger, is right. What they're talking about are justifications like, racial supremacy, or, whether it's class interest, whether it's the police for us, and that. And I think what they're getting at is what makes all that possible. How does that, like, what's underneath those justifications, right? So, and they're very critical here, directing this not only at like those kind of movements, but they take the pain to criticize what appears to be revolutionary movements here too, such as the Russian Revolution, the Leninist break. So on 344, after they make that move, they write revolution. Or let me back up. This situation is not at all adequate, however, for resolving the following problem. Why do many of those who have or should have an objective revolutionary interest maintain a preconscious investment of a reactionary type? And more rarely, how do certain people whose interest is objectively reactionary come to affect a preconscious revolutionary investment? So, right, this would be like changing the ideology, right? Must we invoke, in the one case, a thirst for justice, a just ideological position, as well as a correct and just view, and in the other case, a blindness, the result of an ideological deception or mystification? Revolutionaries often forget or do not like to recognize that one wants and makes revolution out of desire, not duty. So right here, they're making it, I think, really clear that it's not as though someone's obeying like a maxim above them. There's something desiring that's, to use like the Holland term, that's there's a force acting upon them. They're being pushed a certain way. They're being produced in that manner. They go on to write, here as elsewhere, the concept of ideology is an execrable concept that hides the real problems, which are always of an organizational nature. If right at the very moment he raised the most profound of questions, namely, why do the masses desire fascism, was content to answer by invoking the ideological, the subjective, the irrational, the negative, and the inhibited, it was because he remained the prisoner of derived concepts that made him fall short of materialist psychiatry he dreamed of, that prevented him from seeing how desire was part of the infrastructure, and that confined him in the duality of the objective and the subjective.
So if we take the Proud Boys, for example, and we, criticize the ideological aspect of saying, oh, the Proud Boys are, the result of white supremacy. So they are enacting this kind of, ghost in the machine into marching the street and taking a stance in front of, the BLM protesters that are actually would be striving for, would be an expression of the fairness of an equality system. And then we reverse it, saying that it's desire. The desire on one side is not to be killed anymore. It's, not to live in poverty anymore, not to be discriminated anymore. It's a will to live. It's a will to existence. While the Proud Boys are a will to maintain power, a will to do as they were doing prior to the expression of dissent by the BLM. So it's not this ideological cathedral that is over us that tells us to act this way. Is our desire is being blocked by the other, and we tend to have we take actions in front of this blockage, so we can liberate our own flux.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because for them, at least for Deleuze and Guattari, we can talk about what they say their goals are. We can talk about any organization's goals, but that's not going to help us understand what they want to do when they're doing it.
Yeah, but the goal is already secondary, because the goal is the rationalization of desire.
And that's my point. So we can talk about goals and all that, but that's not going to help us understand what it is these groups are doing and why they're desiring what they're doing. So I agree with you.
Someone was talking. Who was that?
I just like to say that I think a way of thinking about this is, the question of, well, what do you do in a daily basis, and what do you pay attention to, and what does society pay attention to through the media and so forth, and so that's continually changing, right? But what you pay attention to is driven by these desires. They're kind of like an expression of the desires, and what you pay attention to either reinforces the aggregates that are already in place as an assemblage, or it reforms them.
Well, and it's the reforming them that I'm I'm really interested in, and I really attached to when we were reading it the first time, because the idea that, as they say, the unconscious and preconscious can actually be opposing each other almost, where the unconscious desire might be revolutionary, but because of how it's sort of carried underneath the investment or the preconscious sort of class interest, it can be turned into a reactionary, very much the reactionary pole. It's a, I don't know. I have a lot of opinions about what's happening on the Trump side of things, or the Trump followers and their sort of general mentality. And it's not so much that they're being tricked at all. I side with that, but part of what they talk about here is essentially the idea that even if with revolutionary power or desire or whatever it may be that's sort of sitting there, the investments that allow a person to expand their power or the intensity of that to the greater degree, the degree of that force, the degree of development that interest allows in the desire is ultimately what really attracts people. That there's feels almost like a fish will grow to the size of the fish tank you put them in. My desires will grow to fit whatever tank you end up putting it in as well.
Well, it produces them.
Right.
And that can be sometimes hard here, because it's not necessarily that the people are choosing to be Proud Boys in this sense, is that they're finding themselves produced as that, which is kind of a strange way of talking about it, because we want to talk about like the intent, right? Like they are intending to do this, or like, there's they're trying to accomplish these goals. But this almost flips it to say they're produced in a certain way that might be in favor of those goals, but that's not necessarily why they're doing it.
Because what's at the basis is necessity all the time. Wherever you are on the political spectrum, you will act out of necessity, and then you will rationalize this action into either a project, set of goals, or an infrastructure, or an organization. And on one of the articles that I'm writing on right now, it's a person into an institution, and the person wants to live, wants freedom, wants to be mobile, wants to go out, wants to do things, to go work, have sex, whatever else, and be free. And so there's this necessity that makes freedom and liberty at the center of his existence. And if he was not into the institution, he would never think like that. But because of the necessity that he's put in, the condition in which he is, desire will organize itself, to go outside the walls. And to go outside the walls, there's a necessity of, organizing new conditions. So, he puts out a new cooperative of assisted living. It devises all this thing as like a war machine to actually go against the state and say, hey, there's alternatives, there's other possibilities, and I will take them. And there's the whole action that is going on from this organization and from his will to live outside. But we can, in a classical political science or anthropological understanding, we will try to like see the goals, understand the goals and the principles and the values and everything. But from a Deleuzian perspective, we start from the necessity, and we see how the conditions are being created of the expression of desire in a certain modality. But it's like seeing it on reverse. So if we take BLM, if we take the alt-right, if we take any social movement, it kind of works like that also. There's the pre-individual drive that actually creates the individual with their desires. Their desires are being expressed into a certain form, and they will identify with whatever that is in front of them, because they're already constituted as an equivalent to this category. So it's really taking what we considered as normal into an analysis, and like reversing it completely by starting with the desire and the flux, instead of starting with categories or any transcendental regime that put the etheric form in front of the material forms or necessities.
Yeah, if you think about it in terms of like attention, you could see that, what each individual pays attention to is motivated by their desires, and what all of the other molar groups pay attention to are motivated by their desires. And so what's interesting about this is that attention can change very quickly and become something different and start building up other structures than the structures that we assume have such permanence, because all we have to do is change our attention and build other structures instead because we desire that. And those others just will start disintegrating because no one's paying attention to them.
And by bringing the concept of attention, you're bringing in Heideggerian philosophy, and into the ontology of Heidegger, for example, there's a dwelling is to actually go into the sense of the earth, and having this form of contemplation, and finding some harmony with the ontological sense of the world. But what's different in Deleuze and Guattari is that they're saying there's no essential thing that we should put our attention to. We put attention because we are produced a certain way, and then the revolutionary break is to put the attention elsewhere, and create an output for this. For the desire to go through this attention, but also the creation of the object of the attention. And another example for this, because I worked on this, the concept of dwelling with disability. There's the body without disabilities kind of dwelling. We have a certain order of the world. We have a house, we have the place to work, the grocery store, and everything, and it's being constructed on the base of the body with eyesight, hearing, being able to walk, being able to go from one place to another. We create vehicles for that. But what is it to dwell differently for people with disabilities? And how do we create a society differently according to the necessities of different bodies? And it's a really simple thing, but it questions the ontology of normal society by, allowing all those molecular becomings to be expressed into I could say an utopian form, but as projects. And so yeah, it really depends how you put your attention, because when you're doing stuff in your daily life, if you're able-bodied, there's many things you don't see, but when your body starts to be different, you will put attention to different things, and the city or the place you live it takes a different form. You live into a different world, your perspective is completely different. So the minoritarian perspective makes it that you will see the structure of the world for what it is, and you will propose alternatives so your perspective can actually thrive.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, because the way you can think about it is that the way society is kind of constructed, it's projecting a certain bodily set of affordances and capabilities onto each person. And so if you don't have those capabilities and affordances, then suddenly there's this huge problem, like with the when they decided to put in ramps for people in wheelchairs and stuff like that. I mean, there were all kinds of places those people could not go because of the lack of the affordances. And so it's kind of like, this is kind of similar to the body without organs idea, is that all of us is written onto us this ideal body of capabilities that we're supposed to have. And if our bodies just don't have those capabilities, then there's a disconnect there that is fundamental. And so then you have to think about it in terms of desire. In the case where the person has disability, they have desires to live their life, but they're running up against these barriers all the time. and the general society has this desire to make everyone the same, right? And not to make allowances for people who don't have those same affordances and capabilities.
And that comes to like the concept of gender or race also, you know. It's the minorities, the people who are sorry, the people who are being minoritized, they don't have the same affordances. So basically the system is like, you know, become more like, you know, the universal man or the universal white. And it's like getting those people to act into a certain universal way to be integrated. But, you know, this is the differentiation makes it that, you know, it's not possible. So, you know, to break down the molar aggregate or the molar form of society to allow for those perspectives to be taken into account and to express themselves into their own way is, you know, at the base of the ontological of most of the minority groups.
Yeah, one way of thinking about this is that there's this pressure downward by the whole society to project on everyone a certain, you know, category and essence because of that category. But then from the other hand, the what's really going on with people is much more varied and differential than that. And so there's all this leakage where people don't fit into that essence that's being projected on them. And a lot of times those where there's leakages, there's barriers to prevent that. And so people are kind of trapped in this these essential forms that are projected on them by society. And a lot of people want to get out of that, but it's very difficult to do that. But I guess schizoanalysis wants to look at exactly what are the desires on the one side to project this ideal schema on everybody, and what are the desires on the other hand that want to get outside of those molds and barriers that are being projected on.
Yeah, I think we did it for circle. We're back to like where we started, but with somewhat of an explanation.
I loved that. So that was great. Thank you. We want to move on to libido and investment, or straight to the third theses. Let's go ahead and do libido and investment. This is libido, investment, and sex. Basically playing around with the notions and idea that libidinal energy is not sexual, always sexual, also sexual. What is that, huh? How does that work? So it's they say it a few times. Where is that quote? You guys know what I'm talking about. Where is it in here?
Where they talk about sex as, or rather the sexual as something that's non-anthropocentric.
Correct.
I believe it's like 2 sections ago.
No. In this section specifically, they re-reference that and they bring it up once again. I think it is 350. The discussion, they begin on the situation is completely muddled. It seems that schizoanalysis can make use only of indices, machinic indices, in order to discern at the level of groups or individuals the libidinal investments of the social field. Now, in this respect, it is sexuality that constitutes the indices. Not that the revolutionary capacity can be evaluated in terms of objects, aims, or sources of sexual drives animating an individual or group. Assuredly, perversions and even sexual emancipation give no privilege as long as sexuality remains confined within the framework of the dirty little secret. They then go on for a handful of paragraphs to essentially talk through how sex operates as a series of flows, sort of utilizing Lawrence and Klosowski to talk through how sex is handled sort of in general, and how love is handled and all of these fun things. And then they bring it back around to say that there is no difference between sexual and political desire.
So to kick this off, one of the things we want to differentiate here, at least I think preliminarily, where they're talking about indices here, I believe that's them talking about love, which for them is an index of revolutionary and reactionary investments. So for them, when we're getting at love, they're trying to get at it in this unconscious sense of those very investments that they're trying to understand. which for them is, like Kent was saying, that is a major part of schizoanalysis, is to get at those investments. In terms of libidinal production or sexuality, right? Libidinal and production, let me try that differently. Desire and production occurs in relation to those indices, right? So I think I compared it to like to Foucault and like the indices or the matrices he evoked, but it's similar in that sense that desire and production does work with those investments, which are collectively called love here. As I understand them, desire and production, and more specifically, sexuality and the sexual here, they don't mean it anthropomorphically or biologically. They mean it in terms of what is productive, reproductive, and generative.
No, I don't know where I came up with this question, so we're going to skip it. I'll edit this out too. Sorry, Jack. It was a good explanation, but there's just not enough discussion, and I'm trying to remember where I saw this, and I can't find it.
Just focused on a brief example. And this goes to what we've been talking about. So they write on 350, for example, no so-called gay liberation movement is possible as long as homosexuality is caught up in a relation of exclusive disjunction with heterosexuality, a relation that ascribes them both to a common edible and castrating stock, charged with ensuring only their differentiation in two non-communicating series, instead of bringing to light their reciprocal inclusion and their transverse communication in the decoded flows of desire, parentheses, included disjunctions, local connections, nomadic conjunctions. The reason I wanted to highlight this is we've kind of talked about this before, but what they're talking about in this sense is like, as long as we understand like sexuality through like, and this time I'm speaking more like directly humanly, in terms of the heterosexual and the homosexual, and you're one or the other.
In terms of the Oedipal. Yeah,
which causes them to be edible, because you're either one or the other, and in that sense it creates, right, a whole tension is created here, because as soon as you find yourself becoming the other in this sense, you're in a whole mess of trouble here. But in the same sense, to call yourself to always be bisexual in that sense gets into a problem too, because again, you're starting with a category, with a kind of essentialism, right? You have, for them, what they're talking about is the ability to kind of to move between these different things and find yourself constantly affected by their sort of interplay, rather than like today I'm this, tomorrow I'm that, in the sense of like an exclusion. They're constantly working upon you in this sense.
Well, and again, we get back to the idea that just the sheer concept of woman or man, as the quote they have, a woman is not a model anything. She's not even a distinct or definite personality. A woman is a strange, soft vibration on the air, going forth unknown and unconscious and seeking a vibrational response, or else she is a discordant, jarring, painful vibration going forth and hurting everyone, and a man is the same. The idea that gender normativity in general are just these sort of, floaty, nice concepts that are around, and we have the discussions around them, but they aren't a thing to be worshipped or a thing to be the end of a goal, which is very much what Oedipus does. It places things as a goal.
It's because they talk about language, it's the same thing between language and a sentence. The category of a gender is a sentence, but language is the underlying endless possibilities of organization of terms between them, and gender is the same thing. We are being organized into whatever way, and but we are being put into sentences. And I think that to say this into such a poetic way is it puts us into a carceral kind of thing of categories and
identities, as they were talking about, that we seek, because ultimately being part of a machine feels good and pleasure.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? And that's more directly, I think that's what they're talking about in terms of the gregariousness, or where they use the conformism, right? In the sense of like, this is the paranoiac, right? To be of the master race is to be of the right group in that sense. So, right, if you take out like the if we want to talk about it differently in terms of like, all of us know that we're not Aryans or whatever. It's to be in the right. It's to be in the majority, to be in the powered group in this sense. Other thoughts?
No, I mean, this gets into the entire sort of takedown they have of psychoanalysis, which I'm happy to go into. I don't know if it's quite necessary for our review, but this is where they start diving into the idea of Freud's problem. Lacan points out the issue and the original Freudian problem of, hey, are you going to let me fix you and Oedipalize you completely, or are you going to become this awful, persona non grata who can't function in society? It's your choice. It's perfectly fine. I mean, whatever you want to do. One way I can make you healed and healthy and Oedipalize you. The other way I can destroy your life. It's your call, buddy. It's that weird, hilarious thing that Freud does. The false alternatives.
Yeah, and you're going to be that way either. It's not as though you have a choice in that sense, right? It's the either or ionization again. Yeah. Whether in that sense, right, that it's a false choice, because whether you do it or you don't, you're being biunivocalized. And we should be careful here too, in the sense that like their takedown of psychoanalysis is in the sense that they're trying to like de-Oedipalize psychoanalysis, right? And kind of take it somewhere new altogether, which is ultimately what schizoanalysis kind of seems to produce.
The big takedowns, and I know Ken is in here, and I'm sure he'll have a lot to respond to on this. But their big takedown is that psychoanalysis comes in with, here is the classifications people can fit into, and we will get you into one of those. And it doesn't take into account the millions of different things that have influences upon every single discussion the analyst and the analysand have, which they include in here the flows of capital that exist between the two and the way that their interpersonal relations even began. So like the fact psychoanalysis sort of throws all that out and has these very, very rigid sets that it pushes people into, rather than looking at all of the different potentialities for how a person's desiring machines can be affected, how we can get beyond just someone's interests into those unconscious desiring machines, is ultimately their large-scale takedown of psychoanalysis. And that's a short version of it. Ken, do you have more thoughts?
I mean, yeah, I suppose I could come up with a few. Hopefully they're helpful. One of the things that I find abrasive about psychoanalysis is that it tries to be all-encompassing, and in that venture ends up being entrapping. I like the stance at the beginning of the book where they sort of say that like this isn't going to be the new answer to everything, and so on and so forth. This is sort of just a new way to view things and describe things. Like this isn't the final say all be all and everything. Whereas psychoanalysis doesn't really posit itself that way. Psychoanalysis posits itself as a way to grab hold of capital T truth. And in this movement, that mutes becomings. Because then you've given all of these rules, like ontological rules for being, like saying the subject is a nothing, and having very specific views on alienation and separation, insofar as what that means for like a definite dictatorial symbolic order that you can't get out of, and that you're reliant on to like separate yourself from your alienation and narcissism and whatnot. And what I find is that like, so even in its movements to try to free people in a way, so like discussions on jouissance and whatnot, that ends up becoming all entrapping, because now you become fixated on like everything is jouissance. Words don't have meaning, but what gives words their meaning is the jouissance, and so then everything becomes about jouissance, and then you just get fixated on this thing again, or or like you can only be neurotic, psychotic, or perverse. You literally can't be your subject can't be structured or produced in any other way. And then you become convinced that this is how things are, this is what things are, and these are your choices. And now you start producing yourself in these ways. And so this is where I really like Deleuze and Guattari's like idea of lines of flight and whatnot. And where I like this project of Anti-Oedipus.
Yeah, something that can be said that's interesting is that John Baez, who does the in-category theory, he was giving a lecture one time, and he was talking about how when they teach mathematics, they teach people to work with convergent series, and they don't even deal with divergent series, even though there are more divergent series than there are convergent series. And so, the idea of the line of flight is that you take one of those divergent series and see where you end up. And that, of course, is the way to get out of the strange attractors that are, organizing the chaotic space a lot of times. And so this idea of divergence is a really interesting concept that seems like Deleuze and Guattari are developing with lines of flight.
And another thing psychoanalysis does that I find Anti-Oedipus, this may just be my projection, Anti-Oedipus doing is that it totally crushes, like, not totally, but 3/4 of the time, crushes the possibility for mystery, crushes the possibility for like a true radical alterity that can sort of bump you out of your enmeshment in a routine, whether that be like a routine of thought or like an actual habit out in the world, or both. I doubt they're actually separable. But it seems to me that like this, and I don't know, maybe I'm being disagreeable here, but it seems to me that like a certain measure of mystery is necessary to be like gravitated towards things, to be pulled into things, and to actually flow and move in life. And whenever you feel like you've gotten like the capital T truth, like that's when like I guess you get this paranoiac investment thing where like becoming stop, where everything is funneled into a specific category, and there's no longer this I don't know, infinite possibilities available.
That's essentially what to me, that's essentially the difference between the paranoid and schizophrenic poles and the way that Moeller investments operate. They exist in a place where they divert our knowledge into very, very specific coded things. Roger's earlier example of species, I think race, I think sexuality, gender, all of these things are hyper-specific categories that enable us to know the world. It's good. We have to know the world. We have to get around. But at some point when we start saying, well, this is actually the bedrock truth, that we see a lot of this today where there's, I don't want to say belief in ghosts is necessarily the way that there is, but this idea of mystery, the areas we don't know, or knowing where our knowledge stops, is something that is becoming more and more difficult. One of the things that, I'm not sure I'm a fan of the Black Swan, the book, but one of the things I really liked in it is this idea of things we don't know that we know. We tend to know things, we know stuff, but we're wholly unaware of how far the edges of those things go. And when we close out, things, and we sort of take two ideas and we remove the space between them because we've fully solved it as far as we're concerned, those are where we start seeing these closed off paranoiac experiences. And it's the thing is, ultimately their argument is a lot of that stems from this sort of Oedipalization of life. We see it in America where you have the nuclear family. Here's how things are set up. This is the way families are intended to be. So much so to the point where, that's how people justify, having gay rights, is where it's like, oh no, we can too be Oedipal. Look, we're like a mother father. I've seen this argument dozens of times where it's like, look, we're a mother and father too, and we can take care of our kids. The kids grow up the same. They're productive in society. And it's like, yeah, but you're just literally fitting into the Oedipal. You have what you know, and it's that mass. And instead it's about finding those mystery places where we don't understand things, or admitting we don't know, and sort of exploring what that means for us.
Yeah, I've served this opinion as well, and I've been I've been served back in the way that people are desiring their integration in society, and it's really weird to be like radical by any means and say, oh, we should let go of this and go elsewhere where no man or woman or whatever else has gone before. With social movements, for example, what people want is to be integrated. They want to be Oedipalized, but like, is it really a bad thing? And people want to be, people want property rights. That's why they get married, because it allows, the law like gives you property rights, and there's like taxation that is different and everything. That's what they want. They want to be able to make a living. So to be able to make a living, you need to be integrated into this legal, economical kind of system. So, but that's the same thing with the Oedipal, like you need to be Oedipalized to function a little bit in society as well. So to desire it and to ask for it is not necessarily a bad thing. What I'm doing right now into the article that I'm writing, it's about this person, that goes out to the institution. And what I'm saying is that there's a form of biopolitics, but what the person is asking is a different forms of biopolitics. The person is asking for their life to be taken into account, that services actually encounter their life to extend it, or enable its intensification. So basically, it desire a form of repression, a form of organization to be able to thrive. So that's always like the weird moment where we're like, oh, you're being Oedipalized, that's not good. But at the same time, that's sometimes it's like therapy. It's the same thing. Oh, you go to therapy to be fixed, but at the same time, if some people don't have therapy or don't have the drugs, they will just drift more and more. And so I think there's like a romanticism there that is a little bit dangerous, of going full molecular. That is probably not the best thing to do. Or
no, and I again, it's the same thing as saying that their entire thing is saying that you need to become a schizophrenic in order to be a revolutionary. And it's like, no, that's not what they're saying. They're about process. And I think that's what the last thing I want to make sure we hit on is their discussions at length about art and science and the comparative sort of nature between the two, which is not something you see very often. But when they talk about the revolutionary potential of both, they're talking ultimately about them both playing in that place of mystery that Ken was playing with, talking about the things we don't know. We have a process, and the process takes us where it takes us. And we don't really know what's on the other side, and we keep doing the process. And because of that, science and art have a huge potential for revolutionary change. And it's that sort of because science is ultimately a process. And I mean, there is a hilarity to that now, because it's difficult to say that, especially in America, where scientism has become almost non-process, but instead based on just being able to recite trivia and fact. That's not how that works either.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that is interesting, it's not into this book, but like Deleuze talks about it. It's called jurisprudence, and how if we want to change society, if we want to do a revolution, we must set jurisprudence. But to set jurisprudence is to actually change the moral aggregate. So basically, there's this line of flight, this kind of escape that we talked about before, as escaping the capture of the state. But to enable the capture of the state into a different manner allows for more moral becomings. So there's this, it's like going against the system with its own tools. It's like to pervert the system into allowing a differentiation. So that's another level of it.
Yeah. And when he talks about the jurisprudence there, right, he's talking about how to develop the territory, right, so as to change what's happening.
Yeah, totally. So like, we've talked about the molar escape before, but like escape to where? Is it like an escape to an outside or to the margin? Not really. It's an escape back to the center. Is to take the center and create a territory into a different manner. It's to deterritorialize and re-territorialize, and not by the state, but by the molecular becomings.
Yeah, because they follow one another, right? Where we have the molecular, we have the molar. So in changing the territory, right, and allowing for a line of escape, we're allowing for a production of differentiation in that sense.
Yeah. So like, if take example of the US, like super simple example, healthcare into the US. Even if healthcare, you can have like Black Panther healthcare, like do your little community and like try to have projects to actually see to the health and the welfare of people. But at the same time, and people with disabilities were doing this, and queer people were doing this also. But there's a moment that needs to be universalized and go back into the state. And if you change the state by like taking it out of his ontological capitalist, take care of yourself, nobody will take care of you, form of ontology, and you move it to a more caring or more socialist form of being together by integrating welfare into the state, it will trickle down and change completely the way that people live, and this will allow for more possibilities. So inequalities on an economic level will start to shift, because people will have access to healthcare, they'll be healthy, and they'll be able to work and not be sick anymore. So but this is this is the molecular demands that are being brought back into the molar and changes the structuration or the infrastructure of the state, that in turn changes the possibilities of becoming, because necessities are being changed in the way. So to do a revolution is not only to like turn the state over completely, is to make the state act into a different manner.
To change the molar in that sense, because it's not. I agree with you. But it's not always the state in that sense. For instance, if we were to talk about like institutions or infrastructure, there's a way in which the state can relate to that, but the state is not the only thing present.
Oh no! I'm just taking this in in my own examples. So
we also, and I've mentioned this before, there's always, they seem to also caution like with changing the molar in this sense, because at least as I read them, they want to change. If we're going to change the molar, it's in relation to the molecular and in relation to the unconscious here. So I give the example of Richard Wolff with the idea of like worker co-op making everybody a shareholder in that sense, and then eliminating the distinction in that sense. Everybody's a worker shareholder. But I also suspect that this could be an instance where the pre-conscious is at play here, in the sense that, aren't you just trying to place them into a new category in this sense? And yes, you will open up new powers, you will change things, but don't you also risk reproducing, or to use the term earlier, integrating them even deeper into that thing from which they might otherwise be able to escape?
Yeah, and then you come to the what Zizek is saying. Modernity was like actually frank about the power relations, and then postmodernity switched this around. In the sense that Walmarts are like, what are they called now? Like partners, or like partial invest. I don't know what's the name of the workers, but they're like contributors to this whole fucking like big machine. But it's an insane kind of like category shift, and it's a shift on the discursive level, but on the the material level of how power is exercised and exploitation is happening, it doesn't change much,
Well, the best example of that in the world is Disney. Anyone who works at Disney, even corporate, calls themselves cast members. So everyone feels like a star. And I'm not joking when I say it. Everyone calls each other cast members, not employees.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And then there you have the instance of recoding and reterritorializing, right?
But I think this is like a partial recoding. This is not a full recoding in the sense that it changes. Well, it makes sense because it changes the relationship that people have to their work and between themselves. So this false sense of it creates a false sense of integration.
Yeah, it's reproductive in that sense, right? You're reproducing what you're leaving by changing the signs in this sense is actually just the reproduction of what you've said you're leaving, right? So like in your example, this is Jacques or Disney, right? You're trying to suggest that they're all part of the cast, right, as workers. And you can maintain that, right, through signs. That's very possible. You can organize that kind of coding process. But in doing so, right, like, how is that any different than what they were previously, right? I mean, I understand the sign value. I understand the code and the surplus value of code there. But where's the differentiation?
I'm reading what Brooks has just posted about cast members of Disney. They say like employees at Chick-fil-A and Chuck E. Cheese restaurant chains, cast members are trained to be as positive and as nice as possible to both the young and young at heart. Any negativity and or mistreatment of any kind, such as swearing, yelling, punching, slaps in the face, etc., by cast members to guests is not tolerated and usually result in termination. The U.S. is fucking weird.
But it was genius. That's old Walt said that everyone at the Disney parks were part of a play, and so he started calling them all cast members. And that extended to Disney corporate. So even in like their corporate offices, everyone's a cast member. Big deal to them. And they really, really make sure they say it, no matter who you are. It's really, it's just fascinating and get in with. We are nearing the end of our time. We are probably going to have another one of these discussions tomorrow. But before we go, does anyone have any last questions or things they want us to cover today about the text? I will wait for a moment, please. You can type it, you can unmute yourself, whatever it is. All right. Well, no questions. I'm going to go ahead and close out today. I think we kind of hit into most of the major ones in this final section. I think we could obviously rabbit hole down most of them. But if there's any questions, don't hesitate to drop it into the follow-up questions chat here. And keep an eye out for our upcoming discussions on the big things like what is a body without organs? What is a full body? What is a clothed body? What are bodies? What is a body? I mean, we'll just start there. A lot of stuff to dig into. So with that, thank all of you for joining us today. And thank all of you for typing who did.